This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. A former Democratic Senate leader says his party better start fixing Obamacare right away. An expert on social media says he can predict congressional elections by monitoring Twitter. And a higher education policymaker has a series of student loan reforms in mind. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Alan Dixon was a senator from Illinois for 2 terms and was chief deputy whip for the Democrats. Well known as a moderate, he has some harsh words for both parties and calls on congressional Democrats to fix Obamacare. And we are joined now on americasdemocrats.org by Alan Dixon, who served 2 terms in the United States Senate as a moderate Democrat from Illinois, rising to the post of deputy whip. His autobiography, The Gentleman from Illinois, it recalls his 43 years of public service, and especially when politics wasn't quite so personal. Senator Dixon, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
I'm delighted to join you. Thank you.
You're quite welcome, and it's great to have you here. You know, you were considered a centrist during your 2 terms in the Senate. Now you say the right controls the Republican Party, the left controls the Democratic Party. What's the
Correct.
result? What's the result of that polarization?
Well, I think the result of it is that you obviously see on most occasions that the fundamental outlook of the situation in a given state controls what kind of products you get. Now, we're talking on a day when that's not quite so. In the state of New Jersey, a Republican obviously has won overwhelmingly and may very well be placed now in a position to be the Republican candidate for president. Should that occur, I think you're going to see a change, a vast change in some of the views of the Republican Party. On the other hand, it's clear that in the state of Virginia, the Democrat McAuliffe has won narrowly, but your attention is called to the fact that the Republican who failed and who was early thought to be the probable candidate, the probable elected senator, has shown that there's an unhappiness in Virginia which is surrounded with people from all the parts of that great, huge metropolitan area who are unhappy, principally, I think, about the healthcare situation right now. And that calls our attention to the fact that there's still work to be done there. And I'm of the opinion that the thing that the majority party ought to be doing right now, the Democrats, is taking into account that they clearly have a problem with health care, clearly have a problem with its acceptance by the country, and they better make some changes. Now, the quickest thing to do is to start introducing some legislation that they support as the majority party. What's a good example? Well, the first example is there's all kinds of proof that the president actually did say, if you have a policy and you like it, you get to keep it. Well, it's also clear that that isn't true. Now, he might not at the time have expected it to not be true, but the fact is it is not true, and that's one of the problems in the country. And the first thing the majority party ought to be doing in the U.S. Senate on a basis that will make it acceptable in the Republican House is to pass some kind of legislation that makes it clear that if you have a policy, you can keep it. You don't need to change it. You don't have to accept something mandatorily pressed upon you by the Congress. See, that's what's causing an extreme amount of bitterness in this country. If we could get to the point where people can keep what they have if they want it, that'd be a fine start. There's other things I think you have to do. And what ought to happen is the two political parties ought to be meeting. They ought to have people of substance from both houses talking together. Frankly, in my opinion, with the willingness of the president to bring about the changes that are required to make this a more honorable and acceptable change in the country's legislation that the people want. And I think a decent health care program, correctly legislated in a way that will be acceptable to the country, would be fine.
Now, you say the best government is provided when the executive and the legislative branches are controlled by different parties. Why is that? Yeah, why is it? I mean, would a Republican takeover of the Senate next year make things better for the country, rather than keeping Democratic control?
I'm not arguing that. Here's what I'm saying. That when you have absolute control, you do things in excess. Absolutely. You follow that? When in the first 2 years of this administration, when they got all the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, some of them I really think in my heart against their will. I could even name some of them that I know in their heart did not want to do this, that brought about the passage of health care that went over to the House, of course, was stamped with the approval then of the House majority and the Speaker, Pelosi. And, those sort of things don't work well in the long term. Whenever you have total control of both houses and the executive branch as well, brother, you're going to have troubles, and you're going to make the country mad 100% of the time. That's exactly what's happening right now, and that's exactly what needs to be cleared.
We're speaking with former Senator from Illinois, Alan Dixon, served 2 terms in the United States Senate. You were a supporter of the original Graham-Rudman legislation that created the budget sequester that's now slashing safety net program. But in retrospect, was that legislation a mistake? I mean,
no, that legislation was not a mistake in my opinion. There were a lot of people on my side supported that. When I say a lot, not a majority, but for instance, Fritz Hollings was clearly a Democrat, and he was one of the co-sponsors. I supported it. I think you need to have constraints on the budget. You need to have ways to keep things under control. When things get out of control, again, coming back to when you have an absolute majority that can do what it pleases, you have trouble.
In 1991, you provided one of the decisive votes in the narrow 52-48 confirmation of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court.
It cost me my seat.
I wasn't going to bring that part up, but I mean, was he really? Did you really consider him qualified for the job? And do you think that he has in fact served well?
Well, I really considered him. First of all, I considered him qualified for the job, and he was endorsed as qualified by the American Bar Association. Secondly, I discussed it with him and liked what he had to say personally as a candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court. Thirdly, I did not believe that he'd done anything that was an impropriety with the lady in question. I won't go into that in detail. I think they had a relationship. They'd been several places together. There's a lot of relationships take place in Washington, D.C., believe it or not. But in any event, I thought there was nothing there that disqualified him to be a member of the United States Supreme Court. Now, I will be honest with you. I did not think my vote for him would cost me my seat. I thought it would give me some trouble in my state, which is a very liberal state, but I didn't think it cost me my seat. But when the lady who was the recorder of deeds in Cook County and had an elective county office ran against me, plus the other fellow who had a lot of money and spent $6 million against me in 2 months right before the primary, I lost. I ran second narrowly, but I lost. Well, that's the way it goes. Life's that way. Well, you just accept it, and you go on with your life, and I've done so. But I knew at the time it was a challenge when I did that. Incidentally, my chief officer in my office, who had been with me as state treasurer, the Illinois Secretary of State, 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, begged with me not to vote for Clarence Thomas. And I'm telling you, Al, it could cost you your seat. And I said, no, I won't do that. And I was wrong. He was right. He's still alive. He's still my pal.
Well, he tried.
Nobody could be right all the time.
No, of course not. Now, you were also a member of the Senate Banking Committee, and if I'm not mistaken, a banker yourself earlier in your career.
I'm still on a bank board with U.S. Bank, which is the 5th biggest bank in the country. It's a great bank. We just had a board meeting yesterday. As a matter of fact, Richard Davis spoke to us for quite a bit of time, and it's a wonderful institution. Yeah.
Well, now let me ask you this: Did Congress fail the American people by not regulating the big banks enough?
Good question. My dear friend, it's hard to say where the line is for how much you ought to control somebody and regulate somebody and tell somebody what they can do. We didn't do enough of it before. I think through this process that occurred in the last several years, we've now gotten to the point that maybe we did too much, but all of that is a matter of taste, and all of that's a matter of your point of view. But I know that it's been quite a while now since things have been good in this country economically, and I'm hopeful that soon there will be a change.
Okay. Alan Dixon served 2 terms in the United States Senate, moderate Democrat from Illinois. His autobiography, The Gentleman from Illinois, recalls his 43 years of public service. Senator Dixon, a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for your time with us on americasdemocrats.org.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We'd love to do it again sometime. And
anytime you call.
All right. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Did you know there's an easier and cheaper way than polling to figure out who's going to win a close election? Professor Fabio Rojas has been studying social media and maintains that tweets can predict the outcome of some House races. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Coca-Cola is running a stealth advertising campaign. Stealth? Why would a corporation as ad-dependent as Coke spend big bucks on advertising that it doesn't want consumers to notice? Shh. Because the campaign is a surreptitious ploy to enlist restaurants in a marketing conspiracy that targets you, your children, and, of course, your wallet. Coke calls its covert gambit Cap the Tap, urging restaurateurs to stop offering plain old tap water to customers. Quote, every time your business fills a cup or a glass with tap water, it pours potential profits down the drain. Cap the Tap can put a stop to that, says Coke, by teaching your crew members or waitstaff suggestive selling techniques to convert requests for tap water into orders for revenue-generating beverages. The program provides a guide for restaurant managers who would direct Coke's customer assault, a backroom poster to remind waitstaff, quote, when and how to suggestively sell beverages, and a participant's guide to put suggestive selling foremost in the mind as staff confronts the enemy. Customers. Tactics include outflanking those recalcitrant customers who insist on water. Just switch the sales pitch to bottled water. Remember, Coca-Cola owns Dasani, one of the top-selling brands of bottled water in the U.S. Early in its Cap the Tap scheme, the beverage behemoth offered 2 incentive programs for waitstaff: Suggest More and Score, and Get Your Fill. Both were competitions to spur servers to push more Coke on American restaurant goers. This is Jim Hightower saying Coke's CEO has declared that, quote, obesity is today's most challenging health issue, and solving it requires all of us doing our part. Really? By selling more Coke? That's proof that hypocrisy is now the official rocket fuel of corporate profits.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Indiana University professor Fabio Rojas studies politics and social media, and he believes that Twitter activity can predict the outcome of close House elections. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Fabio Rojas is a professor of sociology at Indiana University who has written about how social movements generate lasting organizational change. He is the co-author of a recent study measuring the impact of Twitter on congressional elections. Fabio Rojas, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Now, you are the co-author, as I mentioned, of an interesting study that could put pollsters out of business, I think. I mean, you say that with almost near certainty, the amount of Twitter traffic mentioning one of the two-party candidates can predict the election outcome. How is that possible?
Right. So basically what we believe is happening is that when a candidate gets traction, they're getting more attention, they're getting more publicity and so forth, then people will start talking about it. And once people start talking about it, we can pick that up and we can measure that. And that is going to be an indicator of the future vote count for that race. So, for example, if everybody's talking about, if Obama is generating excitement, then lots of people are going to talk about Obama, even if they don't like him. And they're going to talk about Obama because he's the winner or the person about to win. And that's what we're trying to measure in this study. We looked at each congressional district. We looked at all the tweets that mentioned the Democratic or Republican candidate. And then we looked at the percentage that mentioned one candidate, and that correlates with the two-party vote share on Election Day.
Now, your study shows that Twitter traffic mimics what polls measure, and you use the example of a House race in Ohio. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. So in looking at this data, what we discovered is that in a lot of cases, especially for cases that were competitive, the Twitter data could actually mimic or resemble what you get in a poll. So, for example, there is that House race, I believe is Ohio District number 3, where the Republican got about, I believe, 45% of the vote, and the Twitter share was about 47%. And we noticed that a lot of races were like that, where the Twitter share was within a couple of points of the final vote, and that is within the margin of error of a traditional poll. Now, that didn't work for all races. So one thing we discovered was that the race is very uncompetitive, where there's a huge gap very often between the social media measurement and the final vote tally. So, for example, there are races where, like, the Republican or the Democrat was getting like 80% of the vote, like Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. And in that case, the Twitter traffic does not closely track the election day outcome, and it can be off by 10, 15, 20 points. And what we believe is happening is that when you are already going to win the race, and it's so obvious, people stop caring. And then the discussions about you and your opponent become very random. It could be about you, say, going to a meeting or the school board meeting or going to a mall opening or cutting a ribbon or something like that. And that's very random, and it's not necessarily related to how people are going to vote. But in other races, like in Ohio District number 3, we could actually get very close to the final election outcome. And that tells us that this has the potential to supplement or even replace polling in some cases.
We're speaking with Fabio Rojas, professor of sociology at Indiana University, co-author of this recent study that we're discussing, measuring the impact of Twitter on congressional elections. So let me be the skeptic here, and just how can it be scientific if it doesn't take into account the presumably large number of Americans, mostly older, I would guess, who do not use social media?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I would agree with you on a certain level, which is that not everybody uses social media. Social media is not representative of the population. So you're right, younger people use Twitter, people who are a little bit wealthier, more educated, they're more likely to use social media. But here's the underlying point. You don't always need a representative sample of people to know what's happening. So let me give you a really nice example. If I want to know whether a building is on fire, I don't need a representative sample of everybody who's in it. All I need is somebody to go on Twitter and say, golly, this house is on fire. Please, somebody come rescue me. And that's essentially what's happening with political races, which is that people on social media aren't representative, but they do pay attention to things. And when something is happening, they start talking about it. And when they start talking about it, we can measure that, and that is an indicator of future voting behavior.
Can a candidate who otherwise may be a terrible campaigner with a terrible record win an election by getting supporters to spend their days tweeting on his or her behalf? I mean, do you have that kind of power where you can perhaps move an election that way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Our theory that my co-authors and I have is that that's not possible, because what we're measuring is we're measuring people's excitement, not whether they're influenced by a tweet. And when I explain this result to people, I say, think about your own experience. You may be a Mitt Romney voter, you may be an Obama voter, but you probably were a Democrat already, right? And you think about it, how many times have you changed your vote because you saw a commercial or a TV ad? Most people don't change their vote on those kinds of things most of the time. And there have been other studies where people have tried to measure how much a vote changes or some sort of behavior changes because your friend didn't. So, for example, in terms of music, you may listen to music because your friend's listening to it, but most people are not going to switch from Democrat to Republican just because their friend recommended it on Facebook. So what that suggests to us is that this is merely an indicator. It's not really telling you about a causal effect. And so what we argue is that, if somebody's a bad campaigner and they pay for somebody to generate a lot of social media about them, that's not going to have a big effect for that reason. And then the other thing to remember is that it takes two to tango. So if somebody pays $1 million for somebody to tweet about Barack Obama, Mitt Romney can do the same. He can go in and pay $1 million to have somebody tweet about Mitt Romney. And what's going to be the overall effect? They're going to cancel out. So for these reasons, we think that it's going to be relatively hard to affect the result through these kind of methods. And the last thing on this point is that we did the study for 2010 data, and that's when Twitter was still kind of new. And we also replicated it with 2012 data, and we found the same relationship. And by that point, people are already generating spam and hiring consultants to go on social media for them, and you get the same results.
Interesting. Now, the other thing, you say this measurement of Twitter has implications for politics in countries with poor human rights records. Do you mean then that measuring social media posts can replace polling or even elections?
Well, in the case of repressive governments, there aren't any polls to start with.
Right.
Nations in the world where people are poor, they don't have a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to pull off a poll. So, for example, I researched how much it costs to do a telephone poll. To get 800 people to answer a 5-question survey over the telephone, so this is bare bones surveying, that costs about $3,000 to $5,000 minimum, right? Mm-hmm. And you can imagine a lot of countries, people don't have that money. Or even if they do have the money, the state doesn't want people to have an independent opinion from the government. So in those cases, social media might be a good opportunity to figure out what people are really thinking and get it out there. And we're already seeing it. So, for example, in Syria earlier, there was the atrocity where the Syrian government used chemical weapons against its own citizens. And we heard about it through Twitter. People tweeted it immediately. So in a lot of cases, you're right that in countries that are not democratic or authoritarian, this could replace polling, or it could be the only thing we have because there is no polling that's allowed.
And it gives people the opportunity to get the word out of what's going on wherever they may be. For instance, Syria, as you brought up. You might not otherwise know it.
That's absolutely correct, and we've seen that in Iran, we've seen that in Syria, and I guarantee we'll see it in more and more places as time goes by.
Very interesting. Fabio Rojas, professor of sociology at Indiana University, co-author of the recent study that we've been discussing today, measuring the impact of Twitter on congressional elections. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a
and
good
we
day.
Thank you as well. And we look forward to more studies because it's pretty neat stuff.
Thanks.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And finally today, higher education expert David Bergeron of the Center for American Progress has a plan to firm up the National Student Loan Program. The first place to start is choosing where to go to college in the first place. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats, David Bergeron is Vice President for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress. He came to that post earlier this year after serving in several top positions at the Department of Education, acting as the Secretary's Chief Advisor on Higher Education and as the head of policy for federal student aid programs. David Bergeron, thanks for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Happy to be here today.
Now, one of the few things Congress has managed to accomplish this year is restoring lower rates on student loans. But the entire student loan market is still in trouble, is it not?
Well, the student loan market clearly is challenged. We've got about $1.2 trillion outstanding in student loans, both federal and private today. And that's a real strain on the economy with students having to repay those loans. And we know that about 40% of all of the people who are repaying those loans are having difficulties. So it is certainly troubled.
How bad is the overall student debt in terms of sheer dollars and in terms of how many families it affects?
So about nearly 40 million people have student loans outstanding today. So that's a huge number. And as I said, 1.2 trillion overall, with about $1 trillion in federal student loans. Wow,
that is staggering to hear those types of numbers. The student debt issues can last an entire lifetime. In fact, I saw one statistic that student loans are still a factor for 29% of heads of houses aged 55 to 64. That's pretty grim.
Well, one of the reasons that is true is we have a growing number of parents of students who are borrowing either for using private loans or through the federal government's PLUS loan program. So, where they're borrowing for their kids' college education. Unfortunately, we do have some parents who are still carrying debt from their own undergraduate experience at the same time that they're borrowing for their kids. And so it is a huge challenge for many adults.
Well, and hopefully you can help us kind of understand what the problem or problems are. Is part of it too much easy credit for college students, or is it just part of the overall Great Recession in which the young people aren't getting the jobs necessary to pay off the loans? Do we need a whole new system altogether?
So we were actually moved to a new system in 2010. President Obama, as part of the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act, when he signed that into law, it moved us to a program where all of the federal loans are now made directly from the federal government and not guaranteed by the federal government but made by banks. So we've moved to a new system. There are some issues with that system, though, that we need to address. First of all, though, we've really got to deal with the issue of college affordability. The president talked about that just last week, making sure that we do more to inform families about the cost of higher education, making sure that institutions of higher education really innovate to drive down costs and improve outcomes, and finally help families repay their student loans more effectively through the expansion of the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan. Taken together, that will solve many of the problems that we face in higher education. But at the end of the day, we really have to find ways to make higher education more affordable so that students have to take on less debt. That's the critical issue. It's the one thing we really have to deal with if we are going to make sure that $1.2 trillion in student loans outstanding doesn't grow to $2 trillion.
That seems like an awfully tall order. Where do you start?
Well, the first place you start is where the president started, which is to make sure that students and families make better choices about where to enroll in higher education. And at the end of the day, to make sure our federal student aid funds flow to institutions and to students enrolled at those institutions that have good outcomes. Part of the reason we have students with more debt is because it's taking longer to get degrees, because institutions aren't, implementing policies to get their students through in 4 years. So, for example, the 4-year graduation rate from public 4-year colleges today, the median is 21%. That means that for the vast majority of our students, it's taking 5 years or 6 years. Think about it. If it takes you 6 years, you're taking on a third more debt than if you do it in 4. And so we've got to work to make this system work more quickly, get people through more quickly and more affordably. The second thing, though, is, at the back end, we need to make sure that students have the ability to repay their loans as a proportion of their income. The President's Pay-As-You-Earn plan, something that implemented last December 21st when I was still with the Department of Education in the administration, provided for most borrowers, recent borrowers, the ability to pay a maximum of 10% of their discretionary income for a maximum of 20 years, and after which time the balance on the loan would be forgiven. Those things are really important. The last one, though, is we've got to find ways, strategies so that we can encourage families to start saving for college earlier. Many states have 529 plans, but those plans work really well for people like me who are able to save, for my daughter's college education. But we were pretty fortunate. Too many people really don't have the ability to save, which just means they need to start saving earlier.
We're speaking with David Bergeron, Vice President for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress. You bring up an interesting situation there, because there are a lot of people that perhaps, when we talk about how long they take to graduate, perhaps family conditions don't allow them to attend enough school in that short amount of time. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of outside factors that would be driving the whole problem right now.
Well, it's certainly true that there are things that often serve as impediments to, progressing through college. You have families where there are illness or where parents lose jobs, and often what that causes people to do is to drop out for a term or two, or decrease the amount of time that they're engaged in their studies. But when it comes to death or illness in the family, I don't say that people shouldn't make the right choice to help their family. But when it comes to things like periods of unemployment, parents, what they should do first is go to the financial aid office on their college campus and see if there is additional help available, because that parent has lost their job. There are provisions in federal law that allow students to get additional aid if something has happened in the family circumstance, and really we've got to get students to do that before they just cut back the number of courses they're taking so that it takes longer. It really hurts them financially dramatically when they take longer to finish.
You've written about ways to make it easier for borrowers who are in over their heads to pay back the loans, and you touched on that briefly a moment ago. Should it be easier for them to declare bankruptcy? I mean, are there other things that can be done?
Well, certainly, if a student had taken on a loan that had really high interest rates, had other kinds of abusive terms, didn't have the ability to get a deferment or forbearance if they're unemployed or become ill. Those kind of loans are like that are written in the private marketplace are really loans that are really problematic, and we would like to see those loans be dischargeable in bankruptcy as any other consumer debt would be. But we'd also like to, and have proposed that if the program of study that the student completed doesn't have an employment outcome that allows them to realize the earnings potential that would allow them to repay their loan, we think that those programs should be considered, and the loans that are made for those programs to be considered for discharge in bankruptcy, just like other consumer debts are. We think that if we did both of those things, we would ensure that most borrowers would be able to deal with their debts more easily because they would ultimately have a better private loan product and really a better higher education experience.
And there is legislation pending in Congress to make it a little easier for student debtors to declare bankruptcy, but what are its chances?
There are a couple of pieces of legislation pending that deal with bankruptcy of student loans, and they face real substantial opposition. They face opposition by banks and others in the financial services industry who really want to see this protection that student loans have extended indefinitely, and really that gives the student loans a preferred place in the products that the banks offer to consumers, but they do it at a significant cost. Unlike the federal loan programs where there are deferments and forbearances in the pay-as-you-earn repayment plan, the private loan products often don't have those conditions, and what that results in is no ability for a borrower to get the kind of second chance which our bankruptcy laws are intended to provide to consumers.
Okay. David Bergeron, Vice President for Higher Education at the Center for American Progress, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. David, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Happy to talk to you.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Alan Dixon, Fabio Rojas, and David Bergeron. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org